On the day I buried my mother, my wife threw my belongings into garbage bags and changed the locks. I drove home from the hospital that morning still wearing yesterday's clothes, my mother's photograph on the passenger seat, 19 minutes of empty highway between me and the worst thing I'd ever seen. She was already on the porch when I pulled up. 4 garbage bags. My boots. My grandfather's toolbox. My whole life in black plastic, stacked by the rail like she'd measured the spacing. I walked up and told her my mother had just died. She looked at me and said, "I know." Then she went inside and turned the deadbolt. What I didn't know yet was that she'd been planning this for 5 months. What she didn't know was that 11 days earlier, a county clerk had flagged a document with my forged signature, and that one flag was about to unravel everything she'd built. Viewers, before we continue, please subscribe, like and share. My name is Portia Gams. I'm a 41-year-old civil engineer working for a private infrastructure firm out of Columbus, Ohio. I've spent the better part of my adult life building things: bridges, drainage systems, overpasses that carry thousands of pounds of steel and rubber without flinching. People drive over my work every single day without knowing my name, and for a long time, that was enough for me. I didn't need the credit. I just needed the structure to hold. I grew up on the east side of Columbus in a 2-bedroom house with linoleum floors and a furnace that groaned every winter like it was personal. My mother, Rena Gams, raised me alone after my father walked out when I was 9 years old. He didn't leave a note. He didn't call. He was just gone one Tuesday morning, and my mother never once let me see how much that cost her. She worked double shifts as a home health aide, came home smelling like antiseptic and someone else's dinner, and still managed to check my homework before she fell asleep on the couch. She is the reason I have a degree. The reason I have a career. The reason I have a house. I married Belle Portia 11 years ago in a rented hall in Westerville. She was sharp, dry-humored, and confident in a way that made me feel like I'd found someone who matched me. I was wrong about what I was matching. But I didn't know that yet. What I knew, standing in the hospital at 6:38 on a gray November morning, was that the woman who had carried me my entire life had just taken her last breath. The monitor flatlined. The nurses came. I sat in the chair beside her bed and held her hand while it was still warm and told her she could rest now. That she'd done enough. Then I called Belle. She answered on the 4th ring and said, almost before I'd finished the sentence, "Are you coming home soon?" Not "I'm sorry." Not "I love you." Just, "Are you coming home soon?" I should have heard it then. I didn't. The drive home from Mount Carmel Hospital took 19 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard the entire way, the way you do when your brain refuses to process anything larger than small measurable things. 19 minutes. 31 degrees outside. A quarter tank of gas. My mother's framed photo sitting on the passenger seat because I'd brought it to the hospital 2 weeks earlier when she stopped being able to recognize the room she was in. I'd been at that hospital for 3 days straight. I hadn't changed clothes. I had a cold paper cup of coffee on the floor of the truck that I'd bought sometime the previous afternoon and never touched. The radio was off. I couldn't have told you what month it was if someone had asked. 6 years before that morning, my mother had pulled me aside at a family cookout in Reynoldsburg and told me she didn't trust Belle. I'd laughed it off. I told her she just needed more time to get to know her. My mother had looked at me with the patience of someone who has already decided not to push, and said, "All right, baby. All right." She never brought it up again. Not until 2 nights before she died, when she grabbed my wrist with the last grip she had left and said, "Portia, don't let that woman hollow you out." I thought she meant grief. I thought she was talking about loss in the abstract, the general weight of what was coming. I kissed her hand and told her not to talk like that. She looked at me. "I mean Belle," she said. I didn't ask her to explain. I told myself she was on heavy medication. I told myself it was the morphine. I turned on to Blenheim Road with her photograph on the seat beside me and her voice still sitting in my chest, and that's when I saw it. A silver sedan in my driveway with its trunk standing open. And Belle on the front porch, dragging a black garbage bag through the door. She hadn't seen me yet. I sat in the truck for 30 seconds before I got out. Maybe longer. I watched her drag the fourth bag through the door and reappear empty-handed, and I noticed she was moving with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this. Not frantic. Not emotional. Organized. There were 3 bags already stacked by the porch rail, tied at the top, lined up like she'd measured the spacing. I got out of the truck. She saw me when I reached the foot of the porch steps and she didn't startle. That was the part that hit me first, not the bags, not the locks, but the fact that she didn't startle. She looked at me the way you look at something you've already accounted for in a plan. I changed the locks this morning, she said. I want you out by noon. I had spent 11 years with this woman. I had held her through 2 miscarriages. I had taken a pay cut 1 year so she could leave a job that was destroying her and take 6 months to figure out what she wanted next. I had sat with her mother in a Savannah, Georgia hospital room for 4 days straight when her mother had a stroke, sleeping in a chair, missing a project deadline, because Belle had asked me to stay. For years into our marriage, my mother had handed me a bank envelope with $40,000 inside, savings she'd built at $200 a month from the time I started college. She pressed it into my hands and said, "For the house, baby. So you have something solid." We used it as the down payment on Blenheim Road. The house was in my name. I looked at Belle standing on that porch, on the porch my mother's hands had helped build, and I said it plainly. My mother died this morning. She looked at me. Her expression didn't break. It didn't soften. I know, she said. Then she stepped back inside and I heard the deadbolt turn. I drove 2 blocks and pulled into a Speedway gas station and sat on the hood of my truck in 31-degree weather with my mother's photograph in my lap. I didn't cry. I think I was too far past the threshold where crying is still an available response. I just sat there while the cold worked through my jacket and looked at her face in the photo, taken at my college graduation, her arm around me, her smile the kind that uses the whole face. I called my cousin Troy Gams. Troy lived in Akron and worked in insurance claims, which meant he spent his professional life looking for the thing that didn't add up. He answered on the second ring. I told him about Mom first. He was quiet for a long moment and said he was sorry in the way people say it when they mean it fully. Then I told him about the bags. About the locks. About Belle's face. Troy didn't say anything dramatic. He asked one question, did she file anything at the courthouse? I didn't know. It hadn't occurred to me. He told me to stay where I was. He drove from Akron in just under 40 minutes. When he pulled into the Speedway lot and got out, he didn't hug me, just stood beside the truck, close enough that I knew he was there, and pulled out his phone. Belle and I had been having problems for 3 years, though I'd been too consumed with my mother's illness to give it the attention it needed. She'd grown cold in degrees, less conversation, less presence, longer hours at her job with the property management company she'd joined in 2019. 8 months before my mother died, I'd found a name in her phone. A contact saved as J. Rowan, appearing repeatedly in her recent calls. She told me it was a client. I let it go. I didn't have room. Troy looked up from his phone. Portia, he said. She filed a dissolution petition 11 days ago. Troy turned the phone toward me. Franklin County Court records, pulled up on a public access portal. Belle's name as petitioner. Mine as respondent. Filed 11 days prior. The petition listed the house on Blenheim Road as jointly acquired marital property subject to equitable division. My mother's $40,000. The house she'd helped us buy. Listed as an asset Belle intended to claim half of. I sat with that for a moment. The cold had gotten into my hands by then and I tucked them under my arms and kept reading. The petition cited my extended absences from the marital home as evidence of a pattern of abandonment. Every night I'd spent at my mother's house during her illness, making sure she took her medication, sleeping on her couch so she wouldn't be alone, had been logged. Dated. Framed as desertion. She had been building this case while I was keeping my mother alive. Troy scrolled further. He'd found a second document, a quitclaim deed dated 3 weeks prior, submitted to the Franklin County Recorder's office under my signature. My name. My handwriting, almost. The county had flagged it and placed a hold on it pending verification, which meant it hadn't transferred anything yet. But someone had tried. I looked at my own signature on that screen. I had not signed any deed. Troy said quietly, she overplayed it. The county flag means she moved too fast, or didn't know the process well enough. He paused. But Portia, this wasn't something she put together last week. This took months. I thought about the refinancing paperwork from 2 years ago. Belli had handled the scanning and compilation. She'd had every document in our marriage run through her hands. I thought about my mother's face 2 nights ago. The grip on my wrist. We need an attorney today, Troy said. Not tomorrow. I nodded. I was still looking at the signature that wore my name. There's a real estate and family law attorney downtown, I said. Ray Curtis. I met him once at a city meeting. Call him. Troy was already dialing. Ray Curtis had a corner office on the 14th floor with windows that looked out over downtown Columbus, and he had the manner of a man who had spent 30 years watching people underestimate paperwork. He was in his early 60s, compact, unhurried. He put on his reading glasses when Troy slid the quitclaim deed across the table in its plastic sleeve and he looked at it for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up he said, "This was flagged by the county recorder as a potential irregular submission. It hasn't been processed. You still hold clear title to the property." He set the document down. But whoever submitted this knew enough about the process to try it, and not quite enough to execute it cleanly. I told him about the dissolution petition. About the abandonment framing. About the months of logged absences while I cared for my dying mother. He listened without interrupting, his pen moving across a legal pad in small, deliberate strokes. I had met Belli at a mutual friend's dinner party in 2013. She was working in property management even then, had a precise fluency with real estate language that I'd found impressive. She knew how titles worked. She knew how transfers worked. I had never thought to wonder what she might do with that knowledge inside our marriage. Ray put his pen down. We file an emergency motion today contesting the petition and flagging the fraudulent submission to the court. We also engage a handwriting expert immediately to formally document that the signature on the deed is not yours. He paused. I want to ask you something. Do you know a company called Rowan Property Holdings LLC? The name J. Rowan moved through me like cold water. A name, I said. From her phone. She told me it was a client. Ray nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he already suspected. Joel Rowan, he said. Cincinnati-based real estate investor. His LLC has made 3 property acquisitions in the Columbus metro in the last 8 months. He looked at me directly. Your wife's name appears as an agent on 2 of them. Ray Curtis gave me the address of his paralegal and told me to have Troy compile every financial document I could access before morning. Then he told us to go eat something because we'd need to be functional, and he said it with the calm authority of someone who understood that grief and adrenaline together will hollow a person out if they don't interrupt the cycle. We went to a diner on Morse Road. I ordered coffee and eggs and ate about a third of it. Troy had pulled Joel Rowan's company registration on his phone by the time we sat down. Rowan Property Holdings LLC, incorporated in Ohio 14 months ago. 2 completed acquisitions in the Columbus area. A third under contract. And there, listed as a licensed agent on the 2 closed transactions, Bell-Lai Portia Gams. She had been operating inside his business while living inside our marriage. The relationship between them had started, as best Troy could reconstruct it from public records and the filing dates, approximately 14 months ago. Which was almost exactly when my mother's diagnosis came in. Which was when I started spending nights away. Which was when Bell-Lai had the most access to our home, our documents, our financial history, and the least oversight. I thought about the 6 years between my mother's warning at the Reynoldsburg cookout and that hospital morning. I had watched Bell-Lai slowly and I had explained away every cold degree of it. The shorter answers. The separate schedule. The way she stopped asking about my mother after the first few months of the illness, as if Rena Gams had already been filed away somewhere and closed. Troy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The house appreciated $130,000 since you bought it. That's what this is about. Get you out on abandonment grounds, claim half the equity in the dissolution, sell fast with Rowan's network." I set my coffee down. "She picked today on purpose," I said. Troy didn't answer. He didn't need to. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text. "She told me you'd figure it out eventually. I'm sorry. I can help. CW." CW was Calvin Weeks. I had worked alongside Calvin at my firm for 6 years. He'd sat at my mother's birthday dinner in September, had laughed at her stories, had complimented her cooking, had shaken my hand at the door when he left. 2 weeks before she died, he and I had eaten lunch at a sandwich place on High Street and talked about an upcoming project bid. He had looked me in the eye the entire time. I stared at his initials on my phone screen for a long moment. Then I called the number back. He answered immediately, like he'd been sitting there waiting. His voice was tight, controlled, the voice of someone who has rehearsed an apology and is frightened of running out of script. He told me that Bell-Lai had introduced him to Joel Rowan 8 months ago. That Rowan had approached him about internal bid information from our firm, specifically, the budget thresholds and technical specs on 2 city infrastructure subcontracts that Rowan's company intended to compete for. Calvin had provided the information. Rowan had used it to submit bids that undercut ours by precise margins. Rowan Property Holdings had won both contracts. Calvin had been passed over for a senior position at our firm in the spring. The position I'd been promoted into. He'd said nothing at the time. He'd sent me a congratulatory email with a handshake emoji. I had thanked him and assumed we were fine, the way you assume things about people who keep their anger quiet and patient and out of sight. I sat in the hotel room I'd checked into that evening, a Courtyard Marriott because I had nowhere else to go, with the lights mostly off and his voice in my ear and my mother's photograph propped against the lamp on the nightstand. She had known. Not the specifics. But she'd known the shape of it, the way a person can sense a structure weakening before they can name which beam is failing. Calvin said, "I'll testify to everything. I have the messages. I have the emails." I told him to call Ray Curtis in the morning. Then I sat in the dark for a long time and didn't move. My mother's funeral was on a Thursday. The church was full. People I hadn't seen in years came to stand in that narrow aisle and tell me she had changed their lives, a neighbor she'd driven to chemotherapy for 8 months without being asked, a young woman she'd mentored through a CNA certification, 3 former patients who wept openly at the casket. I stood at the front and received all of it and kept thinking about her voice, "Don't let that woman hollow you out." I buried her on a cold gray Thursday and was back in Ray Curtis's office by the following Friday. Calvin had provided everything. Text message thread spanning 11 months, Bell-Lai coordinating with Joel Rowan on the property acquisition strategy, Calvin feeding bid information on specific dates, all 3 of them communicating with a precision that made it clear this had never been casual. Ray Curtis called it, flatly, a conspiracy to commit fraud against both my marriage and my employer. The emergency motion had already been filed. The handwriting expert had submitted a preliminary report confirming the signature on the quitclaim deed was not mine. The Franklin County DA's office had been notified about the attempted fraudulent filing and the bid manipulation. Belli arrived at the courthouse with her attorney, Sandra Wick, looking composed in a gray coat. She saw me in the hallway and held eye contact for a moment without blinking, still performing the role of someone with leverage. She didn't know about Calvin yet. She didn't know what was in Ray's folder. When Sandra Wick reviewed the evidentiary packet, she asked for a recess 3 minutes into the session. Belli leaned in and whispered something. Sandra set her pen down with a care that said everything. The dissolution petition was withdrawn before the afternoon recess. No property claims. Standard no-fault proceedings only. As Belli passed me in the hallway afterward, she stopped. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She said, "I didn't think you'd fight back." Then she kept walking. Joel Rowan's real estate license was suspended within 2 weeks pending a fraud investigation by the Ohio Division of Real Estate and the Franklin County DA's office. The bid manipulation case was referred separately to the city's Inspector General. Calvin resigned from our firm before HR could begin its own review, which I had been told, quietly, was already underway. Belli moved back to Pittsburgh by the end of the month. Back to the city she was from, where my name meant nothing and the version of this story she'd carry could be shaped however she needed it to be. I stayed in the house on Blenheim Road. Ray Curtis had told me I had grounds to pursue Belli's assets aggressively, the commissions she'd earned through Rowan's deals, potentially the value she'd extracted from the bid scheme. I thought about it for 2 days and then told him to stand down. Not because I'd forgiven anything. I hadn't. But because the fight was already won and I understood, in a way I couldn't have articulated to anyone else, that continuing would cost me something I didn't want to spend. I wanted the house. I wanted the record to reflect clearly what had been attempted and who had attempted it. And I wanted to get through my mother's estate, the small East Side rental, the houseplants, the handwritten recipes in the kitchen drawer, without a single additional hour in a courtroom. All 3 happened. I cleaned out my mother's house on a Saturday in December. Her neighbor, Mrs. Aldridge, stood in the doorway the whole time and cried softly and told me stories I'd never heard, small kindnesses my mother had done for 30 years without mentioning them to anyone. I gave Mrs. Aldridge the largest houseplant and a box of my mother's teas and drove home with the back of my truck full of the accumulated weight of her life. I carried it all inside. I set it down carefully. I stood in the middle of my living room, my mother's $40,000 in every wall, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had been saved. I visit her on Saturdays now. Mount Carmel Cemetery, east side of Columbus, a simple headstone with her name and the years of her life bracketed beneath it like a quiet statement of fact. I bring coffee sometimes, 2 cups, which makes no practical sense and I do it anyway. The civil case is ongoing. Ray Curtis has a hearing scheduled for January and tells me the Rowan investigation has widened to include 2 other properties in the metro where similar submission irregularities were flagged. I don't follow it closely. I check in when Ray calls and otherwise I let it move at its own pace. Troy comes down from Akron most weekends now. He eats my food and lectures me about getting out of the house more and I tell him I'm fine and he says, fine isn't the same thing as good, and neither of us pushes further than that. He was the first person who asked the right question in that gas station parking lot, and I think about that sometimes, how a single well-aimed question from the right person can interrupt a collapse that was already in motion. I'll sell the house eventually. Not because of what happened in it, but because I think I've been standing still long enough that movement itself has become overdue. I don't know where I'll go. Somewhere with a front porch, probably. That part one inherited from my mother. 2 weeks after I buried her I found a box in the attic I hadn't opened in years, old papers, insurance documents, a few photographs. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope with my name on the front, written in her handwriting. A date on the outside, 8 months before she died. 8 months before everything. I haven't opened it yet. I've held it a few times. Set it back down. I know that's not a rational response to a letter. I know she's already told me the most important thing she needed to say. I heard it in that hospital room, felt it in her grip around my wrist. But some things you're not ready for until you're ready. And I'm getting there. I'm getting there.